I saw her shape against the moonlight before she ever turned around, and something in the stillness of her told me the news before she said a single word. Leah had been my closest friend since the year we both turned 5, the kind of friendship built out of shared chores and shared secrets, two girls who had grown up practically in each other's pockets. So when I found her standing alone in her father's hay barn well past midnight, arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold something together that had already started coming apart, I knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary conversation. "Martha," she said, and her voice cracked on my name. "I haven't bled in almost a month." I didn't need her to explain further. In the world we'd both been raised in, those words carried a weight that needed no translation. I felt the barn floor tilt slightly under my feet, the smell of straw and animal warmth suddenly suffocating instead of familiar. Standing there in the dark, I understood with a kind of sick clarity that the girl I had known my entire life was about to be erased and replaced by someone the community would decide to make of her instead. Before I take you through what happened to Leah, and what happens to girls like her across Amish communities more often than outsiders ever realize, let me tell you who I am. My name is Martha, and this is the channel where I talk about the parts of plain life that nobody hands you a pamphlet about. I was raised old order Amish in a settlement in central Pennsylvania, and I left that life behind when I was 23. If the truth behind the quiet farmhouses and the horse-drawn buggies is something you want to understand, subscribe, hit that like button, and tell me in the comments what part of the world you're watching from tonight. I read every comment, every single one. Here's something that took me years outside the community to fully untangle. In the world most of you grew up in, an unplanned pregnancy is treated, at least in theory, as a private matter, something that belongs to the woman and whoever she chooses to bring into the conversation. Inside the world I came from, nothing is private. Your body is understood to belong, in some real and enforceable sense, to the congregation. Your mistakes are understood to belong to the church, and the moment a girl's condition becomes visible before she's spoken her vows, an entire machinery built specifically for this situation begins to move, and it does not move with anything resembling softness. What outsiders rarely understand is how often this machinery gets used. The courtship customs in many of these communities create exactly the conditions you'd expect: unsupervised time, paired-off evenings, a culture that simultaneously polices appearance obsessively while leaving actual physical boundaries largely undefined. The result is that pregnancies outside of marriage happen at rates the tourist version of Amish life never accounts for. Everybody inside the community knows this. Nobody outside the family directly involved ever says it plainly. And there's a very particular, very well-rehearsed process for handling it once it happens. A process that was about to take hold of my best friend like a hand closing around a moth. Leah was 19. The young man was Aaron, 21 years old, the third son in a family well regarded throughout the district. They'd been seeing each other for the better part of a year, and Leah had confided in me about him during long afternoons of canning vegetables, her face going pink, her voice dropping into that particular register reserved for talking about someone you've allowed yourself to fully hope about. She believed he was going to approach her father soon and ask for her hand properly. She believed wrong, though not in the way either of us expected. When Leah finally told her mother, 4 days after that night in the barn, the reaction wasn't what I imagine most people picture. There was no shouting, no tears, at least not in front of her. Her mother simply went still, set down the basket of mending she'd been working through, and walked into the back bedroom, closing the door behind her with a quiet click that Leah said was somehow louder than any slammed door could have been. Leah sat alone at the kitchen table for nearly 2 hours, the silence pressing down on her from every corner of the house. When her mother finally emerged, her apron had been changed, and her face had been washed clean of whatever had happened behind that door, and she spoke only one short sentence: "Your father will need to speak with the minister." That conversation set the first stage of the process into motion. In our settlement, when an unmarried pregnancy came to light, it wasn't handled privately within the family at all. The bishop and a pair of ordained ministers would arrive at the home, seat themselves in the front room, and call the girl in to answer for herself, in person, out loud, to 3 men who had known her since infancy, men who had stood over her at her baptism and now sat ready to determine what her future would look like. Leah described that meeting to me much later, her hands trembling the whole time she recounted it, even years afterward. They wanted to know the young man's name. They wanted to know how long it had gone on. They wanted to know in language she found almost impossible to repeat, whether what had happened between them had been her choice. There was no one in that room to advocate for her. Not her mother. Not a friend. Nothing but Leah and 3 men holding the full authority of the community in their hands. If this is the kind of story that needs to be heard more, drop a like before we go further. It genuinely helps this reach the people who need to hear it. What came after the confession is where the real architecture of the system reveals itself. The consequence has a formal name within the community: the ban. A temporary but very real form of being cut off from communal life. Leah was placed under it for 6 weeks. During that stretch she could not sit at the family table for meals. Instead she ate alone at a small separate table set up in the corner of the kitchen, watching her parents and siblings from a distance that felt, in her words, like watching her own family through glass. She couldn't accept anything handed to her directly. If her mother passed her a dish, it had to be set down on the counter first, untouched by hand-to-hand contact, before Leah could pick it up herself. She was barred from attending worship, barred from any social gathering with the young people her own age, barred essentially from existing in public as the person she'd been just weeks before. The stated purpose, as the bishop explained it to her, was restoration through humility, the idea that separation from the body of believers would cultivate the proper depth of remorse, ensuring that once she was welcomed back, the lesson would hold for the rest of her life. Leah told me those 6 weeks were the loneliest stretch she had ever lived through. She said she would lie awake at night listening to the muffled sound of her family's laughter drifting from the kitchen, and she felt like a ghost wandering the edges of a house that no longer fully belonged to her. But the ban was only the opening chapter. The consequence that would shape the rest of her life was waiting just behind it. Aaron was placed under the same ban, made to sit through his own version of separation and confession. But the pressure surrounding him moved in a completely different direction than the pressure surrounding Leah. He was expected, without real room for negotiation, to marry her, and quickly, within a matter of weeks, not months. There was no conversation about whether the two of them actually wanted a life together. No space made for the reality that they were still practically children making decisions that would define the next 6 decades. The pregnancy had already decided the outcome before either of them was asked anything. The bishop made the terms explicit: marry within the month, or face being cut off from the community permanently. Aaron agreed, of course. Refusing would have meant losing his family, his inheritance of land, the only world he had ever known how to navigate. So a wedding was arranged, though wedding barely captures what it actually was. A typical ceremony in our world is an enormous, joyful production, hundreds of guests, an entire day given over to feasting and singing, the whole district gathered to bless the new household. Leah's wedding had fewer than 50 people in attendance. No feast, no singing at all. It took place on an ordinary Tuesday morning in her parents' front room, and was finished inside of an hour. She wore a plain dark dress instead of the new dress a bride would traditionally have made for the occasion. There were no flowers anywhere in the room. I stood near the back and watched my closest friend marry a boy who hadn't truly chosen her, in a room full of people who weren't there to celebrate but to witness, while everyone present did the silent arithmetic of counting forward to a due date. Leah didn't cry during the ceremony itself. She told me later she simply had nothing left to cry with by that point. The years that followed were heavier than I have full words for, even now. Leah and Aaron moved into a small attached dwelling on his parents' farm. The baby arrived 7 months after the wedding, a daughter they named Ruth, and Leah loved that child with an intensity that startled even her. But the marriage underneath that love never became what either of them might have wanted it to be, had they been allowed to choose freely. Aaron was never unkind, exactly. He simply wasn't present in the way a husband who'd chosen his wife might have been. He worked long days, ate his meals quietly, slept beside her, and treated the marriage more like an obligation fulfilled than a partnership entered into. The resentment of a future he hadn't picked for himself sat quietly behind his eyes for years. The community's treatment of Leah shifted too, in ways that never fully reversed even after her formal restoration to fellowship. At sewing circles, certain older women would go quiet the moment she walked through the door. At worship, some families steered their teenage daughters toward seats farther from hers. Mothers across the settlement began using her name, almost like a verbal warning sign, telling their own daughters not to end up like Leah. She heard that comparison whispered behind her back for years. And her daughter, an innocent child who had no part in any of it, would grow up carrying the shadow of her mother's story regardless. Everyone in that world could count backward from a wedding date to a birth date. Everyone always knew. I want to be clear about something important here. What happened to Leah wasn't some rare or extreme outlier. It was in every sense the standard procedure. I personally knew of at least 3 other girls within our own district who walked some version of this same path before I eventually left. Every one of them carried the same particular look behind her eyes afterward, the look of someone who understood that a single moment at 19 had quietly rewritten the entire shape of everything still ahead of her. But there's a darker branch of this story that almost never gets discussed openly, and it's the part that still sits heavy with me. Some girls, faced with the prospect of the bishop's room and the ban and the forced wedding, choose a different path entirely. They simply leave. Quietly, before anyone outside their immediate household discovers the truth, they pack what little they can carry, walk to the nearest stretch of road, and accept a ride from an outsider driver heading anywhere away from what's coming. They turn up at shelters, at crisis centers in unfamiliar towns, sometimes at the doorstep of a distant cousin who left the faith years earlier, and is the only person in the family who might understand. I knew a girl named Susanna who did exactly this. She slipped away in the dead of night with less than $100 folded into her apron pocket. Her family told the rest of the settlement she'd gone to stay with relatives out of state. She never returned. The last I heard, she was raising her son on her own in a city several states away, working double shifts at a diner, and her parents have never once met their own grandchild. If you're finding any of this difficult to hear, take a breath, but please consider hitting that like button before you go. It really does help more people find this. After I left the community myself, I spent a long stretch of years in therapy slowly working through everything I had witnessed but never had the language to name at the time. My therapist once asked me why Leah's story had affected me so profoundly, given that it hadn't technically happened to me. I sat with that question for a long while before I understood the real answer. It was because watching what happened to Leah was the exact moment I first saw the world I'd grown up in for what it actually was. Before that, I believed without question that the rules were fair, that the bishop's authority was wise and gentle, that the whole structure existed to protect us. After Leah, I could never again unsee what the structure was actually built to do. I had watched a 19-year-old girl stripped of her future, her dignity, and any meaningful say in what happened to her own life, all in the name of preserving the community's image of purity. And I had watched the young man who shared equal responsibility for that pregnancy walk away with a fraction of the consequence, because in that world, a man's failing was always treated as smaller, more forgivable, more easily absorbed than a woman's. I've turned the theology behind all of this over in my mind more times than I can count. The community would insist the ban is an act of love, that the rushed marriage protects the innocent child, that the lifelong reputation a girl carries afterward is simply the natural result of choices she made. They would point to scripture about sin and the necessity of discipline within the body of believers. I'm not interested in arguing theology with anyone watching this, but I will say plainly, there is no real love that requires a teenage girl to recount the most intimate details of her life to 3 men sitting in judgment of her. There is no real protection in forcing 2 barely grown people into a 60-year marriage neither of them chose for themselves. There is no real grace in a system that punishes the woman more severely than the man who was equally responsible for what happened. Leah is in her 40s now. She still lives in the same county she was born in. She and Aaron stayed married and went on to have 3 more children after Ruth. From the outside, her life looks exactly like every other Amish woman's life around her. She gardens, she cooks, she attends worship every week without fail. But I saw her 3 years ago, when I came back briefly for a funeral. We met quietly in a small coffee shop, because she would have faced real consequences had anyone seen her sitting with someone who had left the faith. We talked for nearly 2 hours, and just before she left, she reached across the table, took hold of my hand, and said something I don't think I'll ever stop carrying with me. She said, "Martha, I love every one of my children, and I wouldn't trade a single one of them for anything in this world. But I want you to understand something. The girl who walked into that meeting with the bishop, she didn't survive it. Whoever I became after that day, she isn't the girl I would have grown into if I'd been allowed to choose. I never got to find out who that other version of me might have been." Then she stood, gathered her things and walked out, and I sat alone in that coffee shop and cried for the better part of an hour. If you grew up somewhere, a single mistake at 19 could quietly decide the entire shape of the rest of your life. I see you. If you've ever watched someone you love disappear into a system that called itself loving while it methodically dismantled her, I see you too. If you've carried judgment from a community that was never proportional to whatever you actually did, you are far from alone in that. The system that closed in around Leah was never really built to protect her. It was built to protect itself, to preserve its own image of order and purity, and the cost of that preservation has always landed hardest on the women too young and too powerless to push back against it. Leah never got to choose her husband. She never got to choose her wedding. She never got to choose the shape of the rest of her life. But she did get to choose what she told me in that coffee shop. And in telling me, she made sure her story wouldn't simply disappear into silence the way so many others have. So I'm sharing it now, because I believe she would want that. Because somewhere tonight, there's a young girl standing in a barn in the dark, 3 or 4 weeks late, terrified, trying to imagine what comes next. And she deserves to know that what's coming for her isn't love, it isn't justice, it isn't the will of God. It's a system, built by people, upheld by people, and like anything built by people, it can be questioned, and it can be survived. If this story stayed with you, tell me in the comments what part you can't shake. Tell me where you're watching from, and your own story too if you're ready to share it. If you want more of these conversations from behind the world I grew up in, subscribe and stay close. There's a lot more I haven't said yet. Until next time, choose your freedoms with care. Sometimes that choice is the one that saves you.